When I pushed open the front door that late afternoon, the first thing I noticed wasn't the silence but the wrongness of it. For 30 years that house had greeted me with familiar noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the hallway floorboard, the faint ticking of the wall clock my wife used to reset every Sunday. This time there was nothing, just a stillness that wrapped around me like a cold hand at the back of my neck. My suitcase slipped from my grasp, hitting the hardwood with a dull thud that seemed to echo too loudly through the rooms. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something unfamiliar, like the residue of strangers. I took a step inside, glass crunching under my boot. My eyes followed the jagged shimmer scattered across the living room floor until they landed on the photograph that had fallen face down, its frame broken in spiderweb lines. I turned it over with trembling fingers and was met with the smiling face of my late wife, framed in cracked glass, her eyes forever bright in a world that no longer felt safe. My heart clenched, not just from the sight of her image desecrated, but from the realization that whoever had been here hadn't just taken things. They had violated memory itself. The coffee table lay on its side, magazines strewn like autumn leaves across the floor, our old stereo system gone, the shelves stripped bare as though someone had reached in and pulled pieces of my life out by the handful. I moved deeper into the house, my breath shallow, every sound magnified. The kitchen was a war zone. Drawers gaped open, silverware scattered across the linoleum. The coffee canister overturned and bleeding grounds across the counter like dark soil. The refrigerator door hung ajar, buzzing faintly. It wasn't just burglary, it was desecration. Each step I took carried the weight of dread up the staircase. My hand gripped the banister, knuckles pale. The bedroom nearly undid me. Our mattress hung half off the frame, dresser drawers emptied. Ella's jewelry box cracked open and silent. The little music box that once played, "The Way You Look Tonight," forever stilled. Her wedding ring, her pearl earrings, the treasures I had guarded like relics, all gone. My knees weakened, but something inside me forced me forward into the study. That was when I saw the safe. The door swung wide, its steel belly gutted. My father's gold pocket watch, a legacy passed down through 3 generations, stripped away. The cash Ella had insisted we keep tucked away for emergencies, gone. The savings bonds we had bought instead of vacations, thinking they would one day help our son, vanished. I sank into my desk chair, my chest heaving, my palms clammy against the wood. The thought formed slowly at first, then cut sharp and deep. Whoever did this knew. They knew the safe was behind the desk. They knew the combination. They knew I would be gone for 2 weeks. My hand shook as I reached for the phone, dialing instinctively. The comm dispatcher's voice was the only anchor in that moment. 911, what's your emergency? My own voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. My house. I've just returned from California. It's been broken into. Everything is destroyed. Sirens wailed through the neighborhood soon after, red and blue lights painting the walls of the home I no longer recognized. Officer Johnson's broad frame and graying temples carried authority, his partner Martinez already snapping photos of the destruction, the camera flash slicing through rooms like lightning. They moved with methodical efficiency, checking corners, dusting for fingerprints, cataloging losses while I stood in the wreckage, numb. Johnson's voice was steady but carried weight. Forced entry. Took time, used the right tools. Whoever did this knew what they were after. Martinez nodded, dusting the splintered doorframe. This wasn't random. They knew exactly where to look. As the inventory of losses grew longer, television, stereo, jewelry, my father's watch, the emergency cash, I felt pieces of myself being stripped away with each item spoken aloud. Then Johnson's eyes met mine, sharper now, more deliberate. "Mr. Mills, who knew you were gone these 2 weeks? Anyone who might know about the safe?" The question hit like a physical blow. My voice faltered. I told my neighbor Roy. I mentioned it to the grocery clerk. And my son Melvin. I hesitated on his name, as if speaking it aloud would make the suspicion real. Martinez glanced up from the safe, his brow furrowing. "Sometimes the people closest to us surprise us," he said, his tone neither accusing nor absolving, just fact. but the words planted themselves like thorns in my mind. Later, after the police cars disappeared around the corner, the house became unbearable. Evidence tags clung to furniture, fingerprint powder coated surfaces like ash after a fire. The silence pressed in from every angle. I gathered what I could into a small bag, but each shirt folded, each drawer rummaged through felt like a betrayal of Ella's memory, as though I was erasing her presence further. I picked up the phone again, this time with heavier hesitation, and dialed my son. His voice on the other end was not the voice of the boy I'd raised. It was clipped, tense, wrapped in something I couldn't name. I told him what had happened, that I couldn't stay in the house, that I needed a couch, just a few nights. His pause felt like eternity. Then his voice, colder than the silence that surrounded me, said the words that would burn into me forever. "I can't, Dad. I don't need another mouth to feed." 35 years of fatherhood collapsed into that single moment. I had carried him through scraped knees and broken hearts, worked overtime to send him to college, loaned him money for his first car, and yet when I asked for nothing but a place to rest, he cut me off with cruelty I could not comprehend. I tried to plead, reminding him that this was his childhood home, that his mother would be ashamed to hear him speak like this. But he only grew more distant, his tone sharp, almost desperate to end the call. Then the line went dead. I sat there with the phone in my hand, staring at the lifeless screen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My chest ached in a way no burglary could cause. Material things could be replaced. Even the watch, the jewelry, the cash, they were painful losses, but they were not fatal. What was fatal was the fracture of blood, the betrayal by my own flesh and blood. Something in Melvin's voice lingered though, not just cruelty but something else. A quiver, a note of guilt, maybe even fear. It was the sound of someone hiding more than indifference. And in that moment, as the night settled heavy over my violated home, a darker thought began to take root. What if this wasn't just abandonment? What if it was something worse? I left the house behind that night, carrying little more than a bag of clothes and a heart cracked down the middle. The porch light of my neighbor Roy's house glowed warmly across the lawn. He opened the door before I even knocked, concern etched deep into his weathered face. "Come in, Silas. You shouldn't be alone tonight." As I stepped into his tidy living room, the smell of fresh coffee and the order of his furniture hit me like a bomb. It was everything my house no longer was. Safe, familiar, untouched. I sat on his couch while he busied himself with blankets and questions, his voice carrying the steadiness of a man who had seen storms before. But even as I tried to accept his kindness, my mind returned to the sound of my son's voice, to the hollow way he had pushed me away, to the unanswered question that now beat louder than my own pulse. How much did Melvin know? The broken glass in my living room, the gutted safe, the absence of trust in my own home, and my son's rejection twisted together into a knot I couldn't yet untangle. But one thing I knew with chilling certainty as I lay awake on Roy's couch that night. This wasn't just about a burglary. This was about betrayal, a betrayal that went deeper than missing objects and violated locks. Something inside me whispered that the true story was only just beginning, and when I discovered the whole of it, my life and my family would never look the same again. The couch in Roy's living room felt foreign beneath my back, even though he had arranged the blankets with military precision, tucking the corners as though the order itself could hold me together. The truth was, no order could fix the fracture I carried inside me. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of his old refrigerator filling the silence where my own house once breathed with familiarity. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ella's jewelry box tipped open like a wound, her ring gone forever, or I heard Melvin's voice through the phone, cold and detached, telling me he didn't need another mouth to feed. That hurt cut deeper than any shattered lock or broken window ever could. Memories rose uninvited, like ghosts from a life that now felt borrowed. I thought of the long winters in Nebraska when Melvin was a boy. We used to shovel snow side by side, our boots crunching in the ice, and he'd laugh when I'd toss a handful into the air like confetti. He'd beg for hot chocolate afterward, cheeks red, mittens damp. Ella would hand me the first steaming mug, always saving hers for last. And I'd feel a quiet pride watching the two of them across the table. The family I worked myself to the bone to provide for. I paid overtime shifts at the plant, skipped vacations, drove an old Buick long past its years. Also, he could walk into adulthood without carrying the same burdens I did. College tuition, down payment for his townhouse, loans quietly forgiven. Every sacrifice had felt like love, and I never once imagined that love could be repaid with cruelty. As dawn pushed pale light through Roy's curtains, I sat up, unable to pretend at rest any longer. The blankets slipped to the floor, and I found myself staring at the worn carpet, tracing its patterns as though they could explain what had gone wrong. Roy appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, his step steady, his expression cautious. He didn't ask questions right away. He simply handed me the cup and sat across from me, watching the steam rise between us. That simple kindness nearly undid me. For a moment I wanted to tell him everything, to spill out the suspicion gnawing at me, that my own son might have had a hand in the destruction of the home he grew up in. But I stopped myself. It felt like betrayal to even form the thought, even though Melvin's voice on the phone had already done the betraying for me. Instead, I offered pieces, small shards of truth, careful and incomplete. I told him about the broken safe, the missing watch, the way the thieves had moved like they knew every corner of my house. Roy nodded, his jaw tightening. He told me he had seen Melvin's car parked in my driveway the week I was gone, maybe twice, maybe more. He said it like it was a good thing, like a son checking on his father's place. But the words turned sour in my stomach. If Melvin had been there, why hadn't he mentioned it? Why lie by omission when he could have said something simple, like, "I stopped by to make sure everything was fine"? I carried that question with me when I returned briefly to my house later that morning, the crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze like a warning. Stepping over the threshold felt like walking into a grave. My shoes crunched against broken glass, and the hollow smell of stale air and fingerprint dust clung to everything. I didn't try to clean. I didn't try to set things right. Instead, I moved through the rooms in silence, touching the surfaces of furniture as if saying goodbye. Every mark of disorder told me a story, but it wasn't the story of strangers anymore. It was beginning to feel like the story of someone close, someone who knew exactly where to dig, exactly what to steal, exactly how to gut me without leaving a blade. Back in the study, I sat at my desk, the chair the only thing still upright. I opened the drawer that held decades of paperwork, receipts, mortgage records, tax returns, college tuition bills. The weight of my sacrifices stared back at me in columns of numbers and faded ink. I remembered Ella urging me to keep every document, saying one day it might matter. At the time I thought she was just being meticulous, but now I realized she'd given me more than paper. She'd given me a record of my devotion, proof that I had always chosen family over myself. And sitting there, staring at the files, I began to wonder if I had chosen wrong. The phone rang, startling me. For a brief, desperate second I thought it might be Melvin calling back, remorse softening his voice. But when I answered it was Officer Johnson. He wanted to update me, though his tone already told me the update was grim. No new leads, no fingerprints matched, nothing solid enough to chase. "This feels personal," he said at last. "Not some random hit. Whoever did this knew what they were after." I wanted to ask him outright if he thought it could be my son, but the words wouldn't leave my throat. Instead, I thanked him for his time and hung up, my hand lingering on the receiver as if it might still deliver the answer I didn't want to face. That evening, Roy invited me again for dinner. We ate meatloaf and mashed potatoes at his small kitchen table, his walls lined with photos of his Navy years, medals gleaming in dusty frames. He spoke easily, filling silence with stories of deployments, of nights spent at sea, of comrades who had become family when family was far away. I listened, nodding, grateful for his company, but inside my mind was elsewhere. Every detail of Melvin's life that I had overlooked began to replay. The overdue bills I'd glimpsed once on his counter, the nights he didn't answer my calls, the way his hands sometimes shook as if he carried a weight he didn't want me to see. Pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to assemble were falling into place whether I wanted them to or not. Later, lying again on Roy's couch, I thought of Ella. I imagined what she would say if she were here, what judgment she would lay down, what wisdom she would offer. She always had a way of cutting to the truth without cruelty. I could almost hear her voice telling me that love didn't mean blindness, that sometimes the hardest thing a parent could do was face the truth about their own child. My chest tightened as though her ghost was pressing her palm against my heart, steadying me, reminding me that betrayal doesn't erase love, but it does demand clarity. I drifted into uneasy sleep, but my dreams were not kind. I saw Melvin as a boy, holding my hand at a baseball game, grinning with missing teeth, asking if I thought he'd hit a home run someday. I saw him at his high school graduation, his arm heavy on my shoulders, telling me he couldn't have done it without me. Then the dreams twisted, and I saw him standing in my ransacked study, his hands rifling through the safe, his face hard and desperate, the watch in his palm catching the light. I woke with a start, sweat chilling my neck, and for a moment I didn't know if it was dream or memory. The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't keep drifting between suspicion and denial. I had to know. I packed a folder of documents from the study, the records of everything I'd provided for him, and tucked it under my arm. Then I drove to his townhouse, the car silent except for the sound of my own breathing. The neighborhood looked worn, tired. The paint on his siding had begun to peel, the lawn unkempt. Struggle was written across his property like graffiti. I parked in the narrow driveway, sat there a moment gripping the steering wheel, then finally forced myself to step out. When he opened the door, his face was pale, startled. His eyes darted behind me as though checking if someone else had come. He invited me in, his voice flat, his movements quick, jittery. The inside was cluttered, dishes stacked, bills scattered, empty bottles pushed into corners. My heart sank. This was not the life I imagined for the boy I had worked so hard to raise. He made excuses, said Wendy was working doubles, said he was tired, said life was heavy right now. I listened, nodded, searching his face for something true. But then I saw it. On the mantel, tucked between photographs and knickknacks, sat a watch. At first glance it looked ordinary, but my eyes knew better. The curved brass case, the slightly bent winding crown, the patina of decades. My father's watch, the same one that had been stolen from my safe. The breath left my lungs, and I gripped the armrest of his couch to keep from collapsing. He noticed my glance and spoke too casually, too quickly. Picked that up at a pawn shop. Good deal. The lie was sharper than a blade. I forced myself to leave not with rage, but with the calm of a man who understood that his life had just changed forever. As I stepped outside, the air tasted different, heavy with something final. Betrayal had a face now, and it was the face of my son. The drive back to Roy's house blurred, but one truth rang clear in my mind. This was no longer just about theft. It was about blood, about love twisted into something unrecognizable, and about the terrible reckoning that would follow. The image of that watch on Melvin's mantelpiece clung to me like a fever. I could still see the brass face catching the light, the leather strap worn smooth from years of handling, the tiny scratch across the glass that I had made myself decades earlier. My father had carried it through the war, my grandfather before him, and someday I had planned to hand it to Melvin in ceremony. Not like this, not stolen, not hidden in plain sight as if it meant nothing. It was impossible to mistake, and yet he had looked me in the eye and lied. The words he used, pawn shop, good deal, sounded hollow, but the ease with which they left his mouth chilled me to my core. I drove away from his house that afternoon, my hands trembling on the wheel, the streets of Omaha blurring into indistinct shapes. I pulled over at a gas station and sat there, the engine humming, my chest rising and falling too fast, while families walked past carrying soda cups and bags of chips as if the world were ordinary. For them, maybe it was. For me, it had shattered. My son had become a stranger in front of my eyes, and the truth was more devastating than any break-in. Burglars could be caught, possessions replaced. But how do you reconcile when your own blood betrays you? When I returned to Roy's house, he was outside tending his garden, trimming hedges with his steady hands. He looked up at me and froze when he saw my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said softly. I didn't answer. Couldn't. Words would have broken me then. I went inside, sat at his kitchen table, and stared at the wood grain until night fell. That night I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes I saw Melvin's nervous hands, the way his leg bounced when I asked questions, the dart of his eyes toward the mantel. My dreams turned into jagged pieces of memory, flashes of him as a boy asking for help with homework, as a teenager lying about denting my truck, as a young man borrowing money with shame in his eyes. I wanted to believe those lies had been small, forgivable part of growing up. But this wasn't small, and forgiveness didn't come easily when it involved the theft of his mother's memories, his grandfather's heirlooms, my entire sense of home. By morning, I had reached a decision. I couldn't ignore it anymore, couldn't push it aside in the hope that I was wrong. I needed proof, something undeniable, something more than suspicion. If I was going to confront my own son, I had to know beyond doubt. 30 years as an engineer had taught me that problems needed evidence, not feelings. So I began my own investigation, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. I started with the pawn shops. Omaha had more than I expected. Tucked between strip malls and gas stations, neon signs blinking promises of cash for treasures. I carried photographs of the watch, of the television, of Ella's jewelry box, printed from old albums, images that felt almost sacred now. At Pete's Pawn Palace on Dodge Street, the owner squinted at the photograph of the watch, then nodded with a certainty that made my stomach turn. "Yeah, I remember this piece. Came in about 2 weeks ago." Young guy, nervous, kept glancing at the door. Said it was his grandfather's, needed cash fast. My throat went dry. "Do you remember what he looked like?" I asked. The man leaned back, rubbed his chin. Dark hair, about 6 foot, mid-30s. Work clothes, oil on his hands. Looked like a mechanic. My heart dropped. He could have been describing Melvin. The receipt copy he produced was dated May 13th, 2 days into my California trip. The signature was barely legible, but the description was undeniable. He had taken my father's watch, worth more in history than in dollars, and sold it for $300. I left with a copy of the paperwork, the ink still smelling fresh. I should have gone home, but I didn't. I went to the next shop, then the next. At Second Chance Electronics, I found my missing television, already priced for resale. At Golden Memories Consignment, Ella's jewelry sat behind glass, tagged with a number that reduced a lifetime of meaning to a few digits. Each time I asked who had brought the items in, the answer was the same. A young man, nervous, in a hurry. The descriptions blurred together until they all painted the same picture. My son, pawning off the life I had built piece by piece. Back at Roy's kitchen table, I spread everything out like evidence in a trial: receipts, photographs, notes from pawn shop owners. My hands shook as I lined them up, but my mind worked with precision, building a timeline that left no space for doubt. While I was in California, Melvin had been in Omaha, driving my house key into the lock, opening the safe I thought only I knew, pawning the heirlooms meant for his own future. It was betrayal written in ink and stamped with dates, undeniable and final. The final confirmation came from the Hendersons down the street. They had a security camera mounted above their garage, and when I asked if they'd seen anything strange, Mr. Henderson pulled up the footage without hesitation. There, time-stamped May 13th at 2:17 p.m., was Melvin's Honda Civic, pulling into my driveway. The grainy video showed his figure stepping out, familiar even through distortion, moving with the restless energy I had come to recognize. My knees weakened as I watched, but inside me a grim clarity settled. Suspicion was no longer suspicion. It was fact. I could no longer protect him with my silence. I could no longer protect myself with denial. The boy I raised, the boy I sacrificed for, had torn apart the life I built and sold it for scraps. Yet even as anger surged in me, sorrow cut deeper. I thought of Ella, how she would have handled this. She had always believed in tough love, in letting Melvin face consequences, even when I softened. If you shield him too much, he'll never learn, she once told me after I paid one of his debts. Maybe she had seen this long before I did. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I drove past Riverbend Casino on the edge of Council Bluffs. I'd heard whispers, Rumors of his late nights, his excuses. Parking across the lot, I watched. 2 hours passed before he emerged, shoulders slumped, his face drawn. He didn't win. He never would. The pieces snapped together like cruel machinery. Debts, gambling, desperation. And me, the father who had tried to rescue him too many times, had become his last bank, his final vault to be raided. When I returned to Roy's house, he watched me lay out the evidence in silence. His eyes grew heavier with every receipt, every photograph. Finally, he said what I couldn't. "You have your answer." I nodded, unable to speak. I felt both relieved and destroyed, vindicated and shattered. Proof had come, but it hadn't brought peace. It had only brought the certainty that the next step would break us both. That night, I stared at the folder of evidence as if it were a living thing. It sat on the table like a loaded weapon, silent but deadly, waiting for me to decide whether to pull the trigger. Confrontation was inevitable now. I needed to see him look at the truth, to watch him try to twist it into excuses, to hear with my own ears whether he could admit what he had done. I told myself it was about justice, about making things right, but deep down I knew it was also about something else. I needed him to know that I knew, that I was not the blind, trusting man he thought I was, that even a father could turn into something harder when pushed too far. I went to bed with that folder on the chair beside me, its weight pressing into my dreams. I dreamed of Ella again, her voice steady, whispering, "Do what needs to be done." I woke with the decision already formed. Tomorrow I would take the folder to Melvin's house. Tomorrow I would place it on his table and let the truth speak louder than either of us ever could. Tomorrow the real battle would begin, not between father and son, but between love and betrayal, blood and justice, memory and ruin. The folder lay on the passenger seat beside me like a silent companion, heavier than its paper should allow, its presence reminding me of every sleepless night, every question I had been too afraid to ask, and every answer I already knew. The drive to Melvin's townhouse stretched longer than it should have, though it was barely a half hour from Roy's neighborhood. I caught myself gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, as though I could squeeze courage out of the vinyl. The morning sun glared across the windshield, washing the streets in blinding light, but I felt none of its warmth. All I felt was the cold certainty that whatever would happen next, nothing in my life would be the same. I had rehearsed the confrontation in my mind 100 different ways. In some versions I was calm, presenting the evidence with the detached tone of an engineer who had reached a conclusion after careful calculation. In others, I was furious, unleashing years of disappointment, shouting the words I had swallowed for too long. But the one I feared most was the version where my voice cracked, where my anger crumbled into sorrow, and where my son saw not a man demanding truth, but a broken father begging for something he no longer deserved. When I parked in his driveway, the familiar Civic sat there, its paint dull, a crack creeping across the windshield like a scar. I sat for a moment, staring at it, thinking of all the rides we had shared when he was younger. Little league games, trips to the hardware store, late-night runs for ice cream when Ella was craving something sweet. Every memory felt like a cruel trick now, a reminder that the boy I had raised and the man who lived behind that door might not be the same person at all. I forced myself to step out, folder tucked under my arm, and walked up the path. My legs felt heavier with each step, my body betraying the weight of what I was about to do. When Melvin opened the door, his face mirrored the same startled look I had seen before, as if every unexpected knock threatened to reveal the secret he had been guarding. He let me in, words tumbling out about stress, about being busy, about Wendy working long shifts. I nodded, letting him talk, letting him fill the space with excuses while I scanned the living room again. The clutter was the same, the bills on the table, the empty bottles lined up like confessions he hadn't spoken. But my eyes went back to the mantel, to the watch that glinted faintly in the light. It hadn't moved. He hadn't even bothered to hide it. I sat on the couch and placed the folder on the coffee table between us. My hands didn't shake this time. My voice, when it came, was low but steady. I told him I knew. I told him I had gone to the pawn shops, that I had the receipts, that I had neighbors' statements, and that I had footage of his car in my driveway when I was 2,000 miles away. With every word, his face grew paler, his body stiffened, and his eyes darted around as though searching for an escape route that didn't exist. At first, he denied it. His voice rose, brittle, insisting I was mistaken, that I was letting my grief twist my judgment. But when I slid the receipts toward him, his hands trembled as he picked them up. When I showed him the photograph of the watch in Pete's shop, his lips parted, but no words came out. And when I pointed toward the mantel, his shoulders sagged as though the weight of the truth had finally crushed him. What came out next wasn't the confession of a hardened thief. It was the desperate rambling of a man cornered by his own mistakes. He spoke of debts, of people who had threatened him, of the $15,000 he owed to men who didn't take kindly to late payments. He said he thought he could fix it, that he could gamble his way out, win enough to buy everything back before I ever knew. His words came faster, tumbling over themselves, building excuses that collapsed the moment they left his mouth. I listened, not because I believed him, but because part of me still wanted to hear my son's voice, even as it carried lies. I wanted to hear something, anything, that resembled the boy who once hugged me at the end of every baseball game, win or lose. But all I heard was desperation, selfishness, and fear. When he finally stopped, panting like he had run a mile, I told him the truth he hadn't spoken. That it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the watch or the jewelry or even the house. It was about trust, about family, about the bond between father and son that he had torn apart with his own hands. His eyes filled with tears then, but they weren't tears of repentance. They were the tears of a man who saw the walls closing in. He begged me not to call the police, said it would ruin him, that Wendy would leave, that his life would be over. He tried to weaponize the one thing he thought could sway me, family. He told me Ella would never forgive me if I turned him in. The words hit hard, sharper than anything else he had said, but instead of weakening me, they hardened me. I thought of Ella, of the way she had warned me not to shield him forever, of her quiet strength in the face of hardship, and I realized she would not have forgiven him either. I pulled out my phone and began to dial. That was when he lunged. His hands reached for the phone, desperation making him reckless. For a moment we struggled, father and son locked in a battle neither of us had ever imagined. But he was sloppy, frantic, and I had the clarity of a man who had already lost too much to let go now. I pulled back, held the phone high, and finished the call. The dispatcher's calm voice cut through the chaos. I reported the burglary, told them I had the perpetrator in front of me, told them I had evidence. Melvin's voice cracked as he pleaded, as he paced, as he tried to bargain. 15 minutes felt like a lifetime, but the sound of sirens grew closer, sealing his fate with every passing second. When the officers arrived, it was the same men who had first walked through my house weeks earlier. Johnson and Martinez entered with professionalism, their faces betraying the faintest flicker of recognition as they saw Melvin standing there, pale and trembling. I handed them the folder, laid out the receipts, the statements, the photographs. I pointed to the watch on the mantel, the final nail in the coffin. They examined everything with the same methodical care they had shown before, their nods quiet but certain. Melvin's pleas turned to silence as Wendy burst through the door, still in her work uniform, eyes wide with panic. She dropped to her knees beside him, demanding to know what was happening, begging him to deny it. But his silence spoke louder than any confession could. Her sobs filled the room as the officers read him his rights, the metallic click of handcuffs cutting through every sound. "Dad, please," he said as they led him away, his voice breaking, his eyes searching mine for mercy. I met his gaze and felt the weight of 35 years pressing down on me. "That's exactly why this is necessary," I told him, my words quiet but firm. When the door closed behind them, I stood alone in that cluttered living room, staring at the empty space on the mantel where the watch had been. The house was silent again, but not like my own had been. This silence carried a finality, a rupture that could never be repaired. I thought I would feel relief, vindication, maybe even justice. But all I felt was hollow, as though in demanding accountability, I had buried something just as valuable as what had been stolen. That night, back at Roy's house, I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on his wall. It wasn't my father's watch, but the sound was enough to remind me that time moved on regardless of betrayal, regardless of loss. I closed my eyes and saw Ella again, her face soft, her voice steady, and I wondered whether she would see this as strength or as failure, whether she would understand that sometimes love demands consequences, even when it tears you apart. The folder of evidence had done its work. The confrontation was over, but the battle inside me was only just beginning, and I knew that the road ahead would not offer easy answers. Justice had been served, but peace remained out of reach. The house was quiet again after the patrol cars pulled away, their tail lights swallowed by the darkness. I sat at Roy's table, staring at the evidence folder now empty, its contents sealed in police custody. For weeks that folder had been the only thing tethering me to truth, and now that it was gone I felt stripped bare, as though I had surrendered not just papers but a part of myself. Roy poured coffee without asking, setting the mug in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it, but the warmth couldn't cut through the chill that had taken root in my chest. The first few days after Melvin's arrest passed in a haze. I gave statements, answered calls from investigators, signed forms I barely read. Every piece of paper was another confirmation that what had once been unthinkable had now become fact. My son wasn't just suspected, he was charged, his name inked into records that would follow him for years. The world suddenly spoke of him not as a boy I raised but as a case number. The words burglary, theft, defendant replaced the name I had whispered when I first held him in my arms. At night, I replayed the confrontation. I saw him crumbling in that chair, his hands shaking, his voice breaking as he pleaded for mercy. Sometimes my mind twisted it, showing me the boy version of him, the one who had stood at the edge of the high school stage, tassel swinging, grinning at me with pride. Other times it showed me the man, pale under the police lights, wrists bound by metal. Both images tore at me until I thought I'd split in two. The hearing came quickly. The courthouse smelled of old carpet and paper, the kind of sterile air that made even the most personal tragedies feel bureaucratic. The prosecutor, Ms. Chun, spoke to me with a measured kindness, explaining options, likely outcomes, what charges might stick. She marveled at the thoroughness of my documentation, called it extraordinary. I should have felt pride, but instead her words hollowed me out. Extraordinary was not the word I wanted tied to this. All I had wanted was to raise a decent man. Now I was the father who built the case that might take his own son's freedom. When I saw Melvin in the holding cell before the preliminary hearing, the sight hit me harder than I had braced for. He sat behind reinforced glass, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look gray. He had lost weight, his cheeks sharper, his eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights. For a moment he didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a boy caught in a storm far too big for him. But when he opened his mouth, the bitterness came out first. He asked if I was satisfied, if seeing him locked up was the victory I wanted. His words were jagged, meant to wound, but underneath I heard something else. A tremor, a note of disbelief, as if he still couldn't understand that his father had finally drawn a line. The conversation went nowhere. I told him I had wanted him to face consequences, not become hardened, not fall deeper. He scoffed, said consequences had destroyed his life. 20 minutes later the guard tapped on the glass and our time was over. I walked out of that building with the weight of failure pressing down harder than it ever had. Back at Roy's house, he studied me across the table, his fork untouched, his expression serious. "You're questioning yourself," he said. I didn't answer right away, but he was right. The thought gnawed at me daily. Had I saved him from destruction? Or had I simply buried any chance of redemption? Roy's voice was steady when he added, "Sometimes love means letting people face the consequences of their choices." I wanted to believe him, but the doubt still cut deep. The weeks blurred into one another. Letters arrived from lawyers, notices of hearings, forms to sign. I read them late at night under the dim light of Roy's kitchen, the words swimming until they became meaningless. I felt the eyes of neighbors on me whenever I stepped outside. Some nodded with sympathy, Others looked away. Mrs. Peterson, who had once greeted me warmly, no longer met my gaze after hearing the full story. Whispers followed me down the grocery aisle, questions I could hear even when mouths stayed shut. Was I a man of principle, or a father who had abandoned his blood? The hearing itself came like a storm. Melvin accepted a plea agreement, 2 years of probation, mandatory counseling, restitution for the stolen items, community service. No prison time, no permanent record if he followed through. Ms. Chun said it was the best outcome possible, that it left room for him to rebuild. Standing on the courthouse steps afterward, I felt no triumph, just exhaustion. There were no winners here, only varying degrees of loss. Weeks later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was his, shaky but familiar. The strokes of a son who had once sent me Father's Day cards scrawled with 2 large letters. I opened it with hands that trembled. Inside, he wrote that his counselor told him to try to understand why I had done what I did. He admitted he wasn't ready to see me, but he wanted me to know he was trying, that maybe one day we could talk. At the bottom he signed it, "Still your son, Mel." For the first time in months, I slept through the night. Half a year passed, and my house became unbearable to remain in. Every corner echoed with violation. Every room whispered with memories that had been desecrated. Boxes piled up, labeled in Roy's careful handwriting, their tapes sealed with finality. I had decided to leave Omaha, to move closer to my sister in Arizona. It wasn't running away, I told myself. It was choosing healing over haunted walls. On the morning of the move, Roy helped me load the last boxes, his hands steady, his silence heavy with the unspoken knowledge that our years as neighbors had become something deeper. "You sure about this?" he asked, tape still clinging to his fingertips. I nodded, though my throat ached. "I'm not running. I'm choosing to heal somewhere new." In the final box, I tucked away the letter from Melvin, edges worn from rereading. Alongside it sat the watch, returned to me after the court proceedings, its brass catching the light one last time in that Nebraska kitchen. I placed it carefully, knowing that someday, when Melvin had walked through the fire of his own choices, I might still hand it to him. But not yet. He wasn't ready. As the moving truck pulled away, I stood in the driveway, the house behind me no longer home but a shell of what once was. Roy clasped my shoulder, his grip firm, his voice quiet. "Take care of yourself, Silas, and don't wait too long to answer when that boy calls." The flight to Phoenix was filled with silence, but it was a different kind than before. Not the suffocating silence of betrayal, but the tentative quiet of possibility. The desert welcomed me with open skies, the heat pressing doubts out of my bones. From the window of my new apartment I could see mountains painted purple and gold at sunset, timeless in their stillness. On my nightstand I placed Ella's photograph and the watch side by side. One was memory, the other legacy, both reminders of what had been lost and what might still be rebuilt. When the phone rang 6 months later, the caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in nearly a year. I answered with a voice steadier than I expected. "Dad," Melvin said. His tone was different, carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. "I wanted to call on Mom's birthday. Thought she'd want us to talk today." "She would have," I told him. "I've been sober from gambling 8 months. The counselor says I'm ready to start making amends." "How do you want to begin?" We talked for 2 hours about addiction, about choices, about the difference between enabling and loving enough to let someone fall. He told me he hated me for what I'd done, but that he understood now. I told him I never stopped loving him, not for 1 second. When the call ended, the desert sky outside burned with colors so vivid it hurt to look at. Tomorrow would bring another conversation, and then another, small steps toward rebuilding something I had thought was lost forever. Justice had been served, but now healing had begun. The watch ticked steadily beside Ella's photograph, each beat a promise that time still offered us both a chance. The months that followed Melvin's phone call were unlike anything I had expected. I had braced myself for silence, for bitterness, maybe even for the kind of distance that becomes permanent with time. But instead, I found myself hearing his voice more often than I thought possible. At first the conversations were cautious, each of us circling old wounds as though afraid to press too hard and reopen them. He would talk about counseling sessions, about temptations he still felt, about the nights when he drove past the casino and gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. I listened, sometimes saying little, sometimes pressing questions he wasn't ready to answer. Slowly, the words began to matter less than the fact that they were happening at all. I kept Ella's picture on the nightstand beside the watch, and every time I spoke to Melvin I felt her there, like a silent witness, urging me not to retreat into anger. It wasn't easy. Some nights, when I replayed the way he had looked me in the eye and lied, when I remembered the hollow sound of my home after the burglary, rage returned like a storm. But then I would hear his voice the next day, tired but honest, and I realized rage wasn't what he needed. He needed accountability, yes, but also a father who still believed he was more than his worst mistake. In Arizona, life took on a slower rhythm. The desert had its own kind of music, dry winds against the windows, the distant hum of cicadas, sunsets that painted the mountains in impossible shades of gold and violet. I filled the hours with small rituals, tending a patch of succulents on the balcony, walking the quiet streets at dusk, reading through the stack of old engineering journals I had kept but never finished. Yet even in this new rhythm, Melvin's shadow remained. Every call, every letter, every small step toward rebuilding tugged at the balance I was trying to find. The first real test came when he asked to visit. It was early fall, the Arizona air just beginning to cool at night, and he told me his counselor thought it might help to see me face to face, to prove to himself that he could own his choices without collapsing under their weight. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. For weeks I prepared, cleaning the apartment, cooking meals I remembered he liked as a boy, walking the rooms at night wondering if seeing him in person would undo the fragile progress we had made. When the day came, I stood at the window as his rental car pulled into the lot. My heart hammered as if I were about to face a stranger. But when he stepped out, shoulders hunched, hands shoved in his pockets, I saw not the criminal, not even the addict, but the boy who had once carried his baseball glove everywhere he went. He looked older, more worn, but there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years, a humility that bordered on shame, but also a determination not to hide anymore. The hug we shared was awkward, stiff at first, then lingering longer than either of us expected. We ate in silence, the clink of forks against plates filling the room until he finally spoke. He told me he hadn't gambled in almost a year. He told me he was working extra shifts at the shop, paying back restitution one slow paycheck at a time. He told me Wendy had stood by him through it all, though not without anger, not without tears. And then, with a voice that shook, he told me he didn't know if I could ever forgive him, but he wanted me to see that he was trying. I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness was not something I could summon with a single word. It was something that would take time, something that would have to be proven by actions, not promises. But I told him I was proud of the effort. I told him that acknowledging his failures was a strength I had doubted he would ever find. His eyes watered then, though he blinked the tears back quickly. For the first time in years, I believed he might still carry the lessons his mother and I had tried to give him. After he left that weekend, I felt a shift inside me. The anger no longer burned as hot. The sorrow no longer suffocated as much. What remained was something quieter, something that resembled hope, though I was afraid to call it that too soon. The following months brought more letters, each one a little steadier than the last. He described his counseling in detail, admitted moments of weakness, but also described victories. The night he walked away from a poker table even after being lured by friends, the time he paid an overdue bill without asking for help, the day he finally cleared the last of his restitution payments. Each letter felt like a stone removed from the wall between us. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. It was spring again, and the desert was blooming in flashes of color after rare rains. Melvin called to tell me Wendy was pregnant. His voice carried both fear and wonder, and he confessed he wasn't sure he deserved to be a father after everything he had done. I sat in silence for a long time after hanging up, staring at Ella's picture, wondering how she would have answered him. And I realized that maybe this was his second chance, not just with me, but with life itself. When their daughter was born, I flew back to Omaha for the first time since I had left. Holding that baby in my arms, smelling the powdery sweetness of her skin, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Renewal, continuity, the realization that even broken lines can sometimes reconnect, not in the same place, but in a new one. I gave Melvin the watch then, not as a reward, not as a full pardon for what he had done, but as a promise. I told him it came with responsibility, that it represented not just history but also a chance to rebuild a legacy worth passing down. His hands shook as he took it, his tears finally spilling as he whispered that he would not waste the gift again. That night, alone in my sister's guest room, I thought about the long path that had brought us here. The burglary, the lies, the arrest, the endless nights of doubt. Justice had been served, but justice had never been the end. It had only been the doorway to something harder, the slow, painful work of healing. And in that moment, I understood something Ella had always known. Love is not the absence of consequences. Love is the willingness to stand beside someone as they face those consequences, to hold on to hope even when everything else has fallen apart. The desert sunsets back in Arizona seemed different after that trip. Softer, somehow, less like fire and more like a slow exhale at the end of a long day. I still carried scars. I still had nights when memories of the robbery woke me in a cold sweat, when the sound of breaking glass echoed in my dreams. But when the phone rang and I heard my granddaughter's coos through the receiver, when Melvin's voice carried laughter instead of fear, those scars felt less like wounds and more like reminders. Reminders that life doesn't end at betrayal. Sometimes it begins again, fragile but possible, if we're willing to hold on.